Hey there guys, how's it going? Yeah, this is not a video that I planned on making. It's kind of a random video, but basically I was going through some old stuff the other day. I was going through, in particular, my boxing DVD collection, and I was looking through some old boxing DVDs, and for whatever reason I just had the urge to watch an old boxing DVD, and one DVD I came across, and it's one that I forgot about. It's one that I bought many, many years ago, and it's a DVD called Ricky Hatton Hitman. Now, this is basically it's a DVD that documents Ricky Hatton's career from the beginning all the way through to the Costa Zoo fight. Now, it's basically just a highlight reel. It's got a bunch of highlights of several Ricky Hatton fights, a few key moments, and, some interviews with Hatton and interviews with people in his team and whatnot. And it all builds up to the Costa Zoo fight, which was sort of the pinnacle of Ricky Hatton's career in 2005. That's essentially when Ricky Hatton became a megastar, was when he beat Costa Zoo. And that to this day, if you ask any Ricky Hatton fan, or if you ask Ricky Hatton himself, what was the absolute peak of his career, what was his greatest accomplishment, he'll tell you when he beat Costa Zoo. That was his biggest night and his biggest victory. And I found this DVD now, like I mentioned, I bought the DVD many years ago, and I watched it many years ago. And again, I didn't really think much of it when I first saw it. I just kind of felt, yeah, it's a highlight video. It's got a bunch of highlights, and it was quite fun to watch. And I was quite a big fan of Ricky Hatton back in the day, because when I was a young boxing fan, he was one of the biggest names in British boxing, and he was always entertaining to watch. Always a great aggressive fighter. And win, lose or draw, he was always in a great fight. But Ricky Hatton, it's interesting to me watching this DVD in retrospect. Like, I was watching it in retrospect, and I found it fascinating. Like, it was fascinating to me watching this, knowing how Ricky Hatton's career ultimately ended up. And not only that, but if you look at how the landscape of boxing has changed, and if you look at how the culture of boxing has changed. Now, what they did with Ricky Hatton, and why I mentioned particular um, the particular era of Ricky Hatton's career that this DVD documents, is very interesting to me, because it really does expose a lot of the differences with how boxing was viewed back then and how it was viewed now, and how fighters were managed in that era and how they're managed now, and how social media, as well as just more coverage of boxing in general, has made a lot of things more transparent than they were back then. Now, early in Ricky Hatton's career, I believe back in 2001, if I remember rightly, and this is of course documented on that DVD, Ricky Hatton first rose to prominence in the UK by winning the WBU title. Now, the WBU title was one of these. I don't even believe it's around anymore, but back then the WBU was one of these lesser known, alphabet sanctioning bodies. But it wasn't considered a recognized genuine world title by the other sanctioning bodies, but it was kind of just like the IBO. It was one of these stepping stone titles. One of these titles that fighters would win in order to increase their rankings and build up to a title shot for one of the more major belts. And when Ricky Hatton won the WBU title, and it showed a couple of interviews, it showed Ricky Hatton, in these interviews saying he wanted to fight the WBO champion, he wanted to fight the likes of Zab Judah and the likes of Costa Zoo and some of the major world champions in the division. However, it took him a good 3 or 4 years in order for him to get round to even challenging one of these guys. And I think that what happened was, after Ricky Hatton won the WBU title, which again I mentioned is a stepping stone title, the boxing fans in the UK, see, because back then obviously things were very different. There wasn't social media, people weren't as educated or as up to speed on the technicalities and the politics of boxing. So the casual crowd, the casual fans in the UK, so the football crowd, the type of people who Ricky Hatton sort of attracted in the early part of his career, they saw him win the WBU title. and they didn't really care that it was only the WBU title. To them, he was a world champion. So Frank Warren, who was Ricky Hatton's promoter at the time, capitalized on that, and he made Ricky Hatton into an absolute superstar defending that WBU title. Therefore, and why it's very important that I mentioned the WBU is because one of the sort of parameters that came with the WBU, one of the things that made it advantageous to hold, is the fact that although the WBU did have a ranking system, what it didn't have was it didn't have mandatories. So, say if you were the WBU champion, you would have a list of opponents that were up there in the rankings, but you wouldn't be forced to fight any of them. You could essentially defend that belt against whoever you want. And if you go back and look at Ricky Hatton's, his record, his career in retrospect, for I'd say about, I think the first 30, 38, 39 fights of his career, he fought, he scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel. Like, he was fighting old men, he was fighting journeymen, he was fighting, bottom domestic level guys, he was fighting veterans, washed up fighters. But basically, for the vast majority of his WBU title reign, he was just fighting the easiest opposition possible. But what was crazy about it was that even though he was fighting easy opponents, he was absolutely packing out these arenas. Like, the Manchester arena was always buzzing, it was always sold out. It got to a point where Ricky Hatton could go anywhere in the country. He could fight anybody, and he would sell out an arena because he just became so popular with the football crowds. He became so popular with the casual boxing audience because he always brought the excitement, and because he had charisma, and because of the way he was marketed and built up by the media. He was one of the boys, he was working class, he was an everyday man, and that was sort of the that was a selling point for Ricky Hatton, was the fact that he was just an everyday man, a down to the earth guy. And that was how they marketed him. And even though he was fighting easy opposition, guys who really had no place getting a title shot, they were able to market him very well. And I think it was fascinating to see the difference in how they were able to do that back then. Whereas nowadays, due to the age of social media and stuff like that, if they tried to market Ricky Hatton like that now, I don't think it would have been so successful, because people would have said, look, the WBU isn't a credible world title, and the opposition that he's fighting just ain't good enough. We want to see better. But what's also really interesting to me in retrospect, and I didn't really think about this back in the day when I watched those fights, but a lot of these opponents that Ricky Hatton was fighting, like a lot of these veterans he was fighting, and a lot of these journeymen, actually gave him a lot of problems. A few fights were quite alarming in retrospect. For example, Ricky Hatton fought, there was one guy that he fought, Vince Phillips. You guys might remember Vince Phillips. He was a pretty good fighter in his prime, but he was completely shot and completely over the hill when Ricky Hatton fought him. And even though he was completely shot and past his prime, he actually gave Ricky Hatton all kinds of problems. Stunned him several times, busted him up, cut him, made him miss, made him look really limited and really ordinary, and actually gave him just a ton of problems in that fight, gave him a beating at times. Lost the fight pretty clearly on points, but it was one of them fights where you would look at it and you would think, wow, this old, past his prime Vince Phillips is giving Ricky Hatton, who's this young, prime, undefeated champion, all kinds of trouble. There was another fight he had, like against Eamon McGee, for example. Eamon McGee was pretty much a domestic level contender from Belfast, and he dropped Ricky Hatton twice. Again, he cut him, he busted him up, gave him all sorts of trouble, took him the distance. Very close, very competitive fight. In fact, some people actually thought Ricky Hatton lost that fight. It was a close one, but a lot of people thought he lost. So my point is that Ricky Hatton, during his WBU title reign, was having problems against domestic level guys. He was having problems against old veterans. He was really not looking that impressive whenever he slightly increased his competition. See, when he was fighting just old journeymen, guys like Freddie Pendleton and guys like that, he was knocking them out, but he was doing so in very attritional and workmanlike fashion. And it was quite surprising to me in retrospect to see just how little boxing skill Ricky Hatton had. So when you look at how his career ultimately ended up, and the brutal, devastating defeats he ended up with, it really shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody. Now, I mentioned the Costa Zoo fight because this DVD actually has the full Costa Zoo fight as an extra feature. What's shocking about that fight, if you look at it in retrospect, now what Ricky Hatton essentially did, and his management, was they waited Costa Zoo out, because if they'd have fought Costa Zoo a few years earlier when he was active and when he was at his prime, Ricky Hatton would have got knocked out, and he would have got knocked out early. I mean, let's just call it what it is. So when he fought Costa Zoo was in his late 30s, I think. He was also on his way out of the sport. You know, he'd been partially retired already. I mean, he'd been stripped of his titles. You know, he still had the IBF belt, but he didn't have the other two. You know, he was inactive in the sense that he'd only had like one fight in the last 18 months prior to the Ricky Hatton fight. And also, this is another thing I found very interesting. There's actually an interview on that DVD. It's an interview with Costa Zoo, where they asked Costa Zoo about the Ricky Hatton fight. This is on the build up to the fight. And Costa Zoo actually said, quite alarmingly in his interview, he said, Ricky Hatton's young and he's hungry and he's motivated and he wants it. He's definitely a lot more hungry than me because I've already achieved it. So Costa Zoo was basically admitting in the interview that he wasn't really that bothered, that he'd already achieved what he wanted to achieve, so he was on his way out. So yeah, he was basically admitting that he wasn't, you know, the same Costa Zoo from the past. And Ricky Hatton definitely got him at the right time. But not only that, if you actually watch the whole fight, what you'll notice is that Ricky Hatton was pretty terrible. Even though that was his biggest that was his biggest fight, you know, his best victory. He was actually losing that fight, and I know that officially he was probably ahead, but from what I could see in that fight, and even the British commentators agreed, he was losing that fight to Costa Zoo pretty clearly. And the only times that Ricky Hatton was able to have any success was when he broke the rules. You know, he was using his head, using his forearms, he was hitting low. I mean, some of the blatant low blows that Ricky Hatton got away with were really, really bad. And the way that that fight ended was anticlimactic too, because it basically ended, it had one round to go, and Costa Zoo, despite the fact that a lot of people had him ahead in the fight, he actually pulled out in the corner. You know, he actually quit. So, I mean, was he that exhausted that he couldn't get up and finish the fight, or was it a predetermined fight? That's what it kind of makes you think in retrospect, because everything involving that fight was really set up to ensure that Ricky Hatton won. Again, there was British officials, British referee. You know, it was in Manchester. They'd sold out the arena in Manchester. You know, Frank Warren was running the show, and it seemed like everything was predetermined. It just seemed like, even though Hatton wasn't the favourite, he was. It seemed as if it was destiny. Like he was supposed to come out victorious. So that's interesting in retrospect. Like as I was watching it and just seeing all the stuff that led up to it, you know, all the interviews where Hatton had said for years that he would love to fight Costa Zoo, except they waited out Costa Zoo. Like they could have, because of the popularity of Hatton, you know, he could have fought Costa Zoo not that long after he won the WBU title, but they waited until he was what, 38-0 before getting the shot at Costa Zoo, and after he'd been, you know, WBU champion for something like 4 years. And it was really, it was just fascinating to me in retrospect, because you look at fighters nowadays. Let's compare, and again, this is another thing that I find really interesting. Let's compare Ricky Hatton and how he was brought along in his career to a modern day fighter in the same division. Now, let's not forget, Ricky Hatton was a light welterweight. Let's look at a guy like Josh Taylor. Let's look at him, for example. Now, Josh Taylor has had 16 professional fights, and in that 16 fights, he's already fought multiple undefeated world champions. He's he's already unified the division, which I don't think Ricky Hatton ever did, if I remember rightly. You know, he's already unified the division. He's already you know, I would say, at least in my personal opinion, he's already a pound for pound level fighter based on the victories that he's had. And you look at just the way that he was brought along. Like, he fought world class fighters in their prime even before he fought for the title. You know, Victor Postal was a world class fighter in his prime. You know, he fought undefeated domestic level contenders. You know, guys like O'Hara Davis, for example. You know, he fought veteran former champions who still had a lot left, like um, like Miguel Vasquez. The way that Josh Taylor was brought along, and the way that he was managed, to me, is a stark contrast to how somebody like Ricky Hatton was managed. And that's why I say I don't think we'll ever see another fighter like Ricky Hatton. And when I say that, is somebody who was managed so carefully, and brought along so carefully, to the point where he was able to gain a massive viewing audience, and just a massive became one of the biggest draws, if not the biggest draw, in British boxing history. I mean, the type of numbers that Ricky Hatton was doing in terms of just ticket sales, and the kind of intrigue that he had for his events was reminiscent of what we're seeing with Anthony Joshua. But you see, I think because of this age of social media, and how clued up people are on the alphabet titles and things like that, I don't think that the way that Ricky Hatton was managed would work again. Now, how good was he as a fighter? That's the thing, that the reason why I ultimately wanted to make the video was because there are still a lot of people out there who think that he was a pretty good fighter. However, he made mistakes here and there, which led to him getting obliterated by Mayweather and Pacquiao and Sinchenko, and that was all to do with him changing trainers, and that he really should have. He got too big for his boots and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot of theories out there on why Ricky Hatton, ultimately at the highest level, got exposed. Um, I think it's very simple, guys. I don't think he was ever that good a fighter. In fact, when I look at his career in retrospect, and look, I was a fan of the guy. I always was. I always loved watching him fight. And I think that in terms of value for money, he was one of the best. No doubt about it. He was one of the most exciting fighters Britain has ever had. But in terms of overall talent and quality, Ricky Hatton was never a world-class fighter. I mean, a fighter like Joe Calzaghe, for example, he was a world-class fighter. He was a guy that, when push came to shove, he showed what he was made of. You know, when he had the big events, the world-class opponents, he beat them. Whereas when Ricky Hatton fought world-class opponents, when he finally started fighting world-class fighters in their prime, he not only lost, he got knocked out. He was never a fighter who had head movement, never had great defense, very offensive, very workmanlike, but had great stamina. Was a decent banger. Could hit the body, could take a punch in his prime, but that punch resistance got worse and worse as his career went on, and as he was cutting more weight and taking more punches, he just never really was able to show much longevity in his career. And I suppose that there's an argument that could be made that if he'd been fighting better opposition from early on, he might have developed into a better fighter. That's possible, but I'm not too sure, because Ricky Hatton, to me, just had a fighting style which didn't age well. So, and not only that, but he never came across to me to be a particularly intelligent person. He didn't really seem to have very much of a ring IQ. You take, for example, I mean, Joe Calzaghe earlier in his career was very aggressive, pressure fighter, threw lots of punches, lots of stamina, very come forward, very front foot heavy. But Joe Calzaghe was an intelligent man. He was very smart and clever and intelligent, and knew how to win rounds. He knew how to nick rounds. He understood how to get out of trouble when he was hurt and stuff like that. Ricky Hatton, when he would hurt, when he was hurt in a fight, he would get he would just block punches with his chin. He would stand toe to toe. He would try and get even. Like, if you hit him with a haymaker, he would throw a haymaker even though he was out of range. And his final fight against Sinchenko, after watching this DVD, I decided to go and watch that too. I've actually got that on my channel if you want to check it out. Ricky Hatton against Sinchenko, he showed such poor technique in that fight, and such a lack of a ring IQ, that it's actually pretty shocking. Like, Sinchenko was a tall guy, a slick guy, and Ricky Hatton was just walking into jabs all night, walking into right hands, throwing big haymakers, throwing big swings, and it was like Deontay Wilder in there. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of how, there's that old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's like nothing that you would tell Ricky Hatton would ever make him be a technical fighter. He was so set in his ways to the point where he would fight on pure emotion, he would fight off the energy of the crowd, and he was never a high IQ boxer. And that's why I say that I don't ever think that he was ever a world class fighter, nor do I think he ever could have been. I just think that he was a guy who was very exciting. Um, he had loads of heart. He had an amazing fighting heart. He was very entertaining. He was very down to earth at one point in time, but I just think that he was so limited, and I think that he's a prime example. I think that Ricky Hatton's career, in retrospect, is a career that everybody should look into. It's a career that every boxing fan should analyze because it tells you basically how boxing was different not that long ago. How the landscape of casual fans and social media, where you were able to build up a fighter based on basically scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the fact that he had a belt, it didn't really matter. The fact that it was the WBU belt, the fact that he was champion, the fact that people loved seeing him fight, that was enough to make a star out of him. And he became such a popular legend of British boxing due to his drawing power and just how entertaining he was, to the point where the quality of the opponents really, really didn't matter. But I don't think that history will be very kind to his resume or his legacy. I don't view Ricky Hatton as a Hall of Famer. I don't view him as a fighter who should really be looked up to in terms of how he conducted himself in the ring, because I don't think you can really learn a lot from his type of style of fighting. And that's why I've always been quite critical of him as a trainer, because if you look at some of the guys he trains, like Nathan Gorman, or when he used to train Rabchenko, these guys don't really have a jab, they don't really have great head movement, and I think that's reminiscent of Ricky Hatton's fighting style. I just never have viewed Ricky Hatton as a guy who had a very good boxing IQ, if I'm being honest. So that was quite an interesting video I wanted to talk about. I know that I'm kind of rambling, but it's just I had a few things on my mind while I was watching that DVD, and again, it was just something to talk about. Again, I don't mean any disrespect to Ricky Hatton. I was a fan of the guy. I like watching his fights. I think he was always entertaining to watch. He was a really entertaining fighter. Really entertaining. But I just think that in retrospect, it was a fascinating career to talk about. Fighters have different careers. Fighters are brought along, with very different marketing strategies. You look at a guy, like I mentioned, a guy like Josh Taylor. That's a guy who, from the very beginning of his career, he was thrown in the deep end. He was thrown in with tough opponents. Whereas Ricky Hatton was a guy who, they knew his limitations to some extent, but they still were able to make a star of him. And yeah, it's just interesting to me. Let me know what you guys think anyway. Let me know what you think in the comment section. If you watched the whole video and listened to me ramble, then God bless you, man, and thanks a lot. But God bless you anyway, man. And yeah, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching.